Wayne had always loved the quiet isolation of the forest. As a park ranger in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest, he reveled in the solitude that came with the job. The dense canopy of trees, the crisp mountain air, and the serene sounds of nature were all he needed to feel at peace. But peace was a fleeting thing in these woods, especially as the days grew shorter and the shadows longer. It started with a series of peculiar reports. Hikers and campers had been going missing at an alarming rate, more than usual even for such a vast and untamed area. Most of his colleagues brushed it off as people getting lost or encountering wildlife. But Wayne couldn't shake the feeling that something else was at play. There was an eerie pattern to the disappearances, an underlying thread that tied them all together. One evening, as Wayne was patrolling a particularly dense part of the forest, he came across an old weather-beaten cabin that wasn't on any of his maps. It was nestled deep in the woods, far from any known trails or campsites. Curious, he approached the cabin, noticing how the air seemed to grow colder with each step. The door was slightly ajar, creaking ominously as he pushed it open. Inside, the cabin was a mess. Dust and cobwebs covered every surface, and the smell of damp rot was overpowering. There were signs that someone had been living there recently. A half-eaten meal on the table, a pile of firewood stacked in the corner. But what caught Wayne's eye was the wall covered in photographs. Each one was a picture of a person, and beneath each photo was a date. Some were recent, others were from years ago. Wayne's heart sank as he recognized a few faces from the missing persons reports. A loud rustling outside snapped him back to the present. Wayne reached for his flashlight and cautiously stepped out of the cabin. The forest was unnaturally silent, save for the occasional snap of a twig. He called out, but there was no response. His instincts told him to leave, but his curiosity got the better of him. He followed the trail of broken branches and disturbed undergrowth until he reached a small clearing. There, in the center of the clearing, was a freshly dug grave. Wayne's blood ran cold. He approached it slowly, his flashlight illuminating the freshly turned earth. The grave was unmarked, but something was buried there, just beneath the surface. He grabbed his radio and called for backup, but all he got was static. He was too deep in the forest for a signal. Wayne was about to turn back when he heard a faint, almost imperceptible whisper. It was coming from the grave. He leaned in closer, trying to make out the words. Suddenly, a hand shot up from the earth, grasping at his ankle. Wayne stumbled back, falling onto the ground. His heart pounded in his chest as he scrambled to his feet, his flashlight beam darting wildly through the trees. He ran back to the cabin, his mind racing with fear and confusion. When he reached the door, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a trapdoor in the floor, partially hidden beneath a rug. Wayne hesitated, but the whispering from the grave still echoed in his ears. He pulled open the trapdoor and shone his flashlight into the darkness below. A ladder led down into what appeared to be a basement. Wayne took a deep breath and descended the ladder, his footsteps echoing in the confined space. The basement was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of mildew. He swept his flashlight around, revealing a small, cramped room. In the corner was a pile of old rusted tools and a workbench covered in dry blood. But what truly made Wayne's stomach churn was the sight of several cages, each one barely big enough to hold a person. Wayne's hand shook as he approached the cages. They were empty, but the sight of them filled him with dread. He couldn't shake the image of the missing hikers and campers being trapped down here, helpless and terrified. He needed to get out and call for help. Just as he turned to leave, he heard a faint noise from the far corner of the basement. It sounded like a soft moan, barely audible over the pounding of his own heart. "Hello," Wayne called out, his voice trembling. There was no response, but the moaning continued. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight into the shadows. There, huddled against the wall, was a figure. It was a man, dirty and emaciated, his clothes torn and filthy. Wayne recognized him from one of the missing persons reports. "Hang on, I'm going to get you out of here," Wayne said, trying to sound calm. He reached into his pocket for his knife, but the man recoiled, shaking his head violently. No, you don't understand," the man whispered. "It's still here. It's always here." "What are you talking about?" Wayne asked, but the man just kept shaking his head, his eyes wide with terror. Wayne knew he had to get him out of there. He managed to pry open the cage door and help the man to his feet. The man was weak, barely able to stand, but Wayne supported him as they made their way back to the ladder. As they climbed out of the basement, Wayne felt an overwhelming sense of relief. They were almost out, but as they reached the top of the ladder, the man suddenly stiffened, his eyes locked on something behind Wayne. Wayne turned slowly, his flashlight beam revealing a figure standing in the doorway. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. She held a large, rusty knife in her hand, and her expression was one of cold determination. "You shouldn't have come here," she said, her voice low and menacing. Wayne tightened his grip on the man, trying to think of a way out. The woman took a step forward, raising the knife. Wayne knew he had to act fast. He shoved the man towards the door, hoping he could make a run for it, and lunged at the woman, trying to knock the knife out of her hand. They struggled for what felt like an eternity, the small cabin filling with the sounds of their fight. Wayne managed to disarm her, the knife clattering to the floor. He pinned her to the ground, his heart racing. She stared up at him, a strange, almost serene smile on her face. "It's not over," she whispered. "It's never over." Wayne called for backup again, and this time he got through. He gave his coordinates and waited, keeping a close eye on the woman. When the other rangers arrived, they took her into custody and helped the man to safety. Wayne was exhausted, his mind reeling from everything he had seen and heard. As the sun began to rise, casting a pale light over the forest, Wayne stood outside the cabin, watching as the authorities secured the area. He knew this was just the beginning. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many mysteries to unravel, but he was determined to find the truth, no matter what it took. And deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman's words were true. This was far from over. Sarah had always loved the serenity of the wilderness. The sounds of rustling leaves, the calls of distant birds, and the sheer vastness of the untamed land always brought her a sense of peace. When she accepted the position as a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest, she believed she had found her dream job. The forest was dense and sprawling, covering hundreds of square miles, with only a handful of trails cutting through its heart. It was a place that required constant vigilance, and Sarah was more than up for the challenge. Her first few months were uneventful. Routine patrols, guiding lost hikers, and occasionally dealing with unruly campers kept her busy but content. She made it a habit to familiarize herself with every corner of the forest, often venturing off the beaten paths to explore. It was during one of these off-trail excursions that she first noticed something odd. It was a late afternoon, and the sun was beginning to cast long shadows through the trees. Sarah had wandered deeper into the forest than usual, drawn by an old, overgrown path she hadn't seen before. The path led her to a small clearing with the remnants of what looked like an old campsite. There was nothing particularly unusual about it, but something about the place made her uneasy. The air felt heavier, and an unsettling silence hung over the clearing. As she examined the area, she found an old rusted tin box half buried in the ground. Curious, she pried it open, revealing a collection of faded photographs, a journal, and a map of the forest. The photographs were of various people, all smiling and seemingly enjoying their time in the forest. The journal, however, told a different story. The entries were dated back to the 1980s and detailed a series of increasingly bizarre and disturbing events. The author, whose name was Alex, wrote about strange noises at night, the feeling of being watched, and the sudden disappearance of several members of his group. The final entry was particularly chilling. "I don't know what's happening. It's like the forest is alive, and it's hunting us. If anyone finds this, get out while you can." Sarah's heart raced as she read the words. She had heard stories about people getting lost in Blackwood National Forest, but she had always assumed they were just urban legends. She stuffed the journal and the map into her backpack and quickly made her way back to the ranger station. That night, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She decided to dig deeper into the history of the forest. The more she researched, the more she uncovered a pattern of disappearances dating back several decades. Families on vacation, solo hikers, and even other park rangers had vanished without a trace. There were no commonalities between the cases, except for one thing. They all happened near the old, overgrown paths like the one Sarah had found. The next morning, Sarah showed the journal and map to her supervisor, Mark. He listened attentively but seemed skeptical. "It's probably just an old ghost story to scare campers," he said dismissively. "People go missing in the woods all the time. It's dangerous out there." But Sarah couldn't let it go. She decided to investigate further, determined to find out what was really happening. She began by retracing the steps marked on the map, following the paths that Alex had detailed in his journal. It was slow, meticulous work, but Sarah was relentless. As days turned into weeks, she started to notice subtle signs that something was indeed wrong. Strange symbols carved into tree trunks, areas where the wildlife seemed to avoid, and an almost palpable feeling of being watched. The forest, which had once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a labyrinth of hidden dangers. One evening, as she was poring over the journal again, she noticed a detail she had missed before. Alex had mentioned finding a series of old, abandoned cabins deep in the forest. The map included rough coordinates, and Sarah decided to check them out the next day. Armed with her flashlight, a radio, and her trusty backpack, Sarah set out early in the morning. She followed the map, cutting through dense underbrush and crossing streams until she finally arrived at the location. There, hidden among the trees, were the remains of several cabins, long forgotten and decayed by time. As she explored the area, Sarah's unease grew. The cabins were eerily silent, and it was clear that no one had been there for years. She pushed open the door to one of the cabins and stepped inside. The air was stale, and the floor creaked under her weight. She shone her flashlight around, revealing old furniture, rotting wood, and remnants of personal belongings scattered about. Then, in the far corner of the cabin, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A large crude symbol was carved into the wall. It matched the symbol she had seen on the trees, and beneath it, scrawled in what looked like dried blood, were the words, "It watches." Sarah backed out of the cabin, her mind racing. Whatever was happening in Blackwood National Forest, it was far from a simple ghost story. She needed to find out more, but she couldn't do it alone. She decided to return to the ranger station and gather a team to help her investigate further. As she made her way back, the forest seemed to close in around her. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves set her on edge. She quickened her pace, feeling the weight of unseen eyes on her. By the time she reached the safety of the ranger station, she was breathless and shaken. Sarah's return to the ranger station was met with a mixture of relief and apprehension. She knew she had to convince Mark and the rest of the team that something sinister was at play in Blackwood National Forest. The next morning, she gathered everyone in the briefing room and laid out the photographs, the journal, and the map. "Look," she began, "I know this sounds crazy, but there's something in the forest. People have been disappearing for decades, and it's all connected to these symbols and abandoned cabins." Mark looked skeptical but saw the determination in Sarah's eyes. "All right, we'll check it out," he said reluctantly. "But we're doing this by the book, safety first." They assembled a small team, equipped with radios, GPS devices, and enough supplies for a few days. Sarah led the way, retracing her steps to the abandoned cabins. The team moved cautiously, every rustle and crackle in the underbrush putting them on high alert. When they reached the cabins, the atmosphere was tense. Sarah showed them the symbol and the eerie message. Mark's skepticism began to wane as he examined the site more closely. "This isn't normal," he admitted, "but we need more evidence." They decided to split up and search the surrounding area. Sarah and Mark paired up, while the others spread out, keeping in constant radio contact. As they delved deeper into the forest, Sarah's unease grew. The forest was unnaturally silent, as if holding its breath. Hours passed with little to show for their efforts. Just as they were about to regroup, Sarah's radio crackled to life. "Sarah, Mark, come in. We found something," came the urgent voice of one of the rangers. They hurried to the coordinates provided, finding the rest of the team gathered around what looked like an old, concealed entrance to a bunker. The metal door was rusted and partially covered by foliage. With some effort, they managed to pry it open, revealing a dark stairway leading underground. "Should we go in?" one of the rangers asked, his voice shaky. "We need to know what's down there," Sarah said firmly. "Everyone stay close and keep your lights on." They descended into the darkness, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a series of narrow, damp tunnels. The walls were lined with old, flickering light bulbs that cast eerie shadows. As they moved deeper into the bunker, they discovered a large room filled with strange equipment and documents. Sarah picked up a stack of papers, her eyes widening as she read. "It's a research facility. They were conducting experiments on people." Mark's face paled. "What kind of experiments?" "Psychological manipulation, sensory deprivation, and something about the forest itself," Sarah replied. "They believed the forest had some kind of energy they could harness." Suddenly, a loud noise echoed through the tunnels. The team froze, their flashlights sweeping the darkness. "What was that?" one of the rangers whispered. Before anyone could answer, the lights flickered and went out, plunging them into pitch blackness. Panic set in as they fumbled for their backup lights. When the lights finally came back on, one of the rangers was missing. "Stay together," Sarah ordered, her voice trembling. "We need to find him." They retraced their steps, calling out for their missing teammate. The tunnel seemed to twist and change, confusing their sense of direction. After what felt like an eternity, they found the ranger, unconscious and badly injured, near one of the old machines. "We need to get him out of here," Mark said urgently. "This place isn't safe." As they made their way back to the surface, the oppressive feeling of being watched grew stronger. Sarah could almost feel eyes on her back. They emerged from the bunker, the fresh air a welcome relief. But the forest no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a predator's lair. Back at the ranger station, they treated the injured ranger and tried to make sense of what they had found. Sarah knew that they couldn't keep this to themselves. They needed to alert higher authorities and get more resources to uncover the full extent of what was happening in Blackwood National Forest. Over the next few days, officials arrived, and a full investigation was launched. The bunker was sealed off, and the forest was temporarily closed to the public. Sarah's discovery had opened a Pandora's box of secrets that had been buried for decades. As the investigation unfolded, it became clear that the disappearances were linked to the experiments conducted in the bunker. The researchers had believed the forest held some kind of supernatural power, and their unethical practices had somehow awakened something dark and malevolent. Sarah continued to work as a park ranger, but the forest had forever changed in her eyes. It was no longer just a place of beauty and tranquility. It was a place with a dark history, a history that she had helped to uncover. And though the forest was eventually reopened, Sarah never forgot the feeling of those unseen eyes watching her. She knew that some secrets of Blackwood National Forest would never be fully understood or explained. The forest had a life of its own, one that was intertwined with the shadows and whispers of those who had vanished within its depths. Sarah's story spread among the ranger community, becoming a cautionary tale for new recruits. She remained vigilant, always aware of the subtle changes in the forest, the places where the air felt heavier, and the eerie silence that signaled danger. She made it her mission to ensure that no one else would fall victim to the forest's hidden dangers.